Alright, so let's talk about the rules of composition with an emphasis in photography and videography. This is probably the best way to get started for beginners in photography. If you want to take better photos, you should probably learn about the rules of composition. And anybody at any level can follow along, so let's get started. Okay, so the definition of composition is twofold. 1. It is a mixture of something or some things. 2. It is a created work of art, and this includes music and literature. Now, like I said, composition exists in all art forms, and that does include photography and videography. Alright, so here's a famous quote by a famous photographer, Ansel Adams. We'll talk about him. I'm probably going to do a research project on him. He's a landscape photographer, and he spent a lot of his time in like national forests and things like that. Now, he said that you don't take the photo, you make it. So what does he mean by that? Well, anyone can point a camera and take a picture, right? So what separates professionals from amateurs? Now, to sum it up, it's thought and detail. But let's get clear here, okay? You do not need a good camera to take a good photo. When a photo has zero composition, it will only look good to the viewer if the subject matter is rare, personal, or even meaningful to that viewer. Though these photos still make very huge impacts in the world of photography, especially in situations like birthday parties, sheer luck, or even perfect timing, but those photos that lack composition typically lack an artistic appeal as well. These photos are common everyday snapshots that would not be well suited for something like, let's say, an art show. Composition is a major factor that judges will consider when critiquing your artwork. Now, photographers can't rely on sheer luck and perfect timing, and most people can take their own birthday photos nowadays, and so it's a little bit harder to get recognized, but through good composition, anybody can get noticed. When a photo does have good composition, the viewer can easily identify it. This is because time and effort are placed into the photo, and that kind of stuff is noticeable. Photographers are consciously aware of what is going to be inside their frame. Photographers also spend a lot of time planning out their shot, and so a lot of time is spent making prior arrangements to make their envisioned shot happen. You want to pre-visualize what you want your photo to look like before you even set out to take it, and so to achieve even better composition, follow the rules of composition. So what I have compiled for you is 7 rules of composition, but if you were to Google this, you would probably find more, and so that's part of our project. But these 7, I think, are the more important ones to consider for beginners. And so let's talk about these. Alright, so before we get started, anybody going out to take photos, you should consider looking for these options when you're out in the field. Think of it as a pre-composition. Alright, so you want to simplify everything. Albert Einstein once said that everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. You also want to pay attention to your subject and separate everything else. We call this subject separation, so focus on what you want in the photo and then separate everything else. Everything else is probably just a distraction anyways, right? Always be prepared to capture the moods of people and the locations, and be on the lookout for naturally occurring patterns. We'll come back and readdress this pre-composition list, but for now, think of it as something to get started with. Keep it in the back of your mind as you get out there taking your photos. Alright, so let's go ahead and dive right in. But let's just start with half for now. Today we're going to talk about leading lines, the rule of thirds, viewpoint, focal point, and angle of view. Alright, so first up on the list is leading lines. The most simplest form of any art is a dot. And when you connect 2 dots together, you create a line. So there's not much artwork out there that doesn't exist without dots and lines. So as you look through your viewfinder when you're taking photos, what kind of lines do you see? Lines are one of the simplest methods of achieving good composition, so use naturally found lines to lead your viewer's eyes to your subject. Lines can also help emphasize your subject matter, and here's a quick little fun fact. Animals, including us humans, tend to naturally follow lines. So why not use that information to lead your viewer's eyes to the focal point? Alright, so we're going to go through a series of photos, and we'll do this for each rule of composition. I don't want to bore you too much with my commentary, but for now, let's focus on these photos as leading lines and see what the lines are and where do the lines take your eyes. Also, consider if you were the photographer on this location, how would you use lines to help capture your viewer's attention and lead their eyes to the subject? Again, where do the lines take your eyes as you view this photograph? Do the lines lead your eye to the subject? Alright, next up on the list is the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds states that 1/3 of the space from any side of the photo frame is probably the best spot to place a subject. Have you ever been inside the settings of your phone or camera and found a 3x3 grid that can be placed over your LCD screen? Well, that 3x3 grid is for composition. This technique can easily be overused if it's not used appropriately or used when acceptable. Okay, but the rule of thirds reveals more of the story that's within your photo frame, and it provides more detail as viewers focus on your subject. Occasionally, the rule of thirds can be changed, altered, and even broken. Simply put, don't center your subject right in the middle of the frame. Instead, place your subject elsewhere. Just like you see on the right-hand side of the screen, you could place your subject into one of these colored squares, and that would be considered something similar to the rule of thirds. But more specifically, the rule of thirds is what you see here, a 3x3 grid with 9 cross sections. Each of these targets is a focal point to consider for you to place your subject when framing up the rule of thirds technique. So I think this photo is great to point out that the rule of thirds does not have to be perfect. However, you can see that the subject has been placed into one of the third sections of the frame. I think this photo really points out how basic the rule of thirds can be, but don't let basic photos trick you into thinking that the rule of thirds is always going to be basic. And so I want to challenge each one of you to take the best quality photos you can following the rule of thirds. You are allowed to add the grids if you want to, but the grids are there just as a guideline. Do you notice how your eyes kind of swoop through this photo? And did you notice that they kind of follow the lines of the grid that would be there? So I really think that this photo represents the quote by Albert Einstein about simplicity very well. So this particular photo does represent multiple rules of composition. You do see the rule of thirds here as well as lines. But once you understand the concept of combining multiple rules of composition, you'll start to notice each one pop out in all kinds of different photographs. Alright, so moving on to viewpoint. So viewpoint is just basically the point of view, alright, POV. And so you can have a low point of view, a high point of view. This means it can be at eye level or it can be on the ground. Maybe you could take you and your camera at the top of a mountain, or you can take your GoPro that's waterproof and stick it halfway in and out of the surface of the water in the ocean. The viewpoint is what you see. So what do you see? And how do you want others to see it? There's almost always other various factors at play, especially in this sense, but the focal point and the angle of view largely influence your point of view. Alright, so in this particular viewpoint, you can see that the photographer placed their camera on the ground, if not very close to the ground. Now, I don't expect anybody to take a trip to the mountains and climb up somewhere nearly as high as this, but you could always climb up on top of a chair or somewhere else that's higher than normal to get a different viewpoint. It's not always about getting low or high angles, okay? Your viewpoint can be just a different type of quote-unquote viewpoint. Alright, again, so with viewpoint, we got 2 other topics to cover, so let's talk about focal point. What is it about your photo that you want your viewers to notice the most? That is what you as the photographer needs to focus on, so that means the focal point is the main area of focus. Without a focal point, You should just assume that your photos will be difficult for some people to enjoy. So keep in mind that you want your focal point to be very easily identifiable by your viewers. Since we're talking about focal point, I think we should talk about focus. You always want to focus in on your subject, and that's technically your focal point. So we've been looking at some easily identifiable focal points in these recent photos, but what is the focal point here? Are you able to point out the focal point in this photograph? Okay, so the next subtopic of viewpoint is angle of view. The angle of view is sometimes known as viewpoint, but it is technically the angle of your viewpoint. But for now, to understand this, how about try moving closer to your subject, or even walk further away from your subject. What that is going to do is it's going to change the angle of view. Also, if you're using a DSLR or mirrorless camera, you can just simply change your camera lens. Changing your camera lens is the same thing as moving closer or further from your subject, especially when you add a wide-angle lens. Now, I'm sure that some of you have heard of wide-angle lens before, and as I said before, you can quickly change your angle of view by swapping out lenses, but if you have a telephoto lens, you can just zoom in on your subject, and that's another quick way to change your angle of view. Changing the perspective gives photographers more control over their work. Now, there are multiple ways of achieving this, so can you think of some other ways? I do want you to think of some other ways of obtaining a different angle of view, but here are some examples that I've located to provide you to give you a different perspective of what angle of view could mean. I would also like to point out that you do not have to actually take your photo on an angle, but that is also a different type of angle of view. Alright, so we got some quick tips on how to take better photos. Remember, you want to make your photos, don't just take them. Look for lines and incorporate the rule of thirds. Change up your viewpoint and angle of view. Simplify your photos and focus on your subject. Viewers should be able to identify your focal point very easily. Don't be afraid to slow down. Spend more time in the process. And as always, don't forget to have fun.